going to give a presentation on Milton Friedman, and I was first interested to give this presentation because I read a book over the summer called Capitalism and Freedom, and this was one of his texts where he sort of outlines his general ideology on the markets, on social structures, on roles of government. And this lecture is just going to explore some of those concepts and also touch upon something that he's very famous for, and that's really developing the school of monetarists as a theory. So Milton Friedman is a liberal, and he defines his own version of liberal. He's not a liberal that thinks that we should support people through benefit payments like perhaps the Liberal Democrats today. He's what you'd call a classic liberal, which is somebody that believes everyone should have liberal principles. So people have the liberty to do whatever they want in an economy, as long as it doesn't infringe upon somebody else's liberty. And here are just some really biographic points about Friedman. Different things. That I suppose the most important thing is the last one, that in 1976 he won the Nobel Prize, and that was really an accumulation of his work. It was for his theories in the quantity and the supply of money, in theories of social structure, and his whole work to an economist. He's very famous at being an integral part of the School of Economics at the University of Chicago, where he was lecturer for 30 years. And the University of Chicago has got quite a good record of producing Nobel Prize winners. So he developed a lot of his theories there, and it's sort of established as a free market university in which to attend. Now, this is really a main part of his book. It's looking at the relationship between political and economic freedom. Is the relationship, how close are they as a basis? So there, Friedman really is sort of highlighting two main points. And the main one he was saying there is how economic freedom is necessary for political freedom, but it's not sufficient. You still need other things like a stable government, for instance, or a democratic elected system, so that you can have political freedoms at the same time of having economic freedoms. But if you think about it on sort of a basic level, freedom in economic arrangements is political freedom in its own right. You've got things like Adam Smith was talking about, the price mechanism. We can, as consumers, signal to producers what we want to be produced and at what price we want that to be paid at. And hence you are creating some sort of political freedom where you have the ability to choose between different products, the ability to go on holiday to wherever you want because you have the economic freedom of exchange, free exchange controls. You can travel to really most countries in the world, and we can exchange money into different other currencies. So it's an important political freedom to have freedom in economic arrangements. You also have the fact that economic freedom is indispensable towards political freedom. If you look back in history and you look at Tsarist Russia or fascist Italy, Spain or Germany, they all had heavily regulated economies that inhibited their political structure. You have to have economic freedom so that people can protest, that people can decide to have different ways of operating the system in order to have political freedom. And an interesting thought is to consider Hayek, because Hayek came before Friedman, and he was somebody that wrote a book called The Road to Serfdom, and he believed that a state that centralizes and a state that controls economic conditions will lead to serfdom. So if you want political freedom, you have to take the power of the market away from a government. And I'm really going to talk about the role of the government a bit later, but it's very important when you're considering how a state works in harmony with the economy and you're looking at civil liberties. And really, in an economy and in a political structure, you have two main ways of organising people. You can coerce them, so that's where things are heavily regulated, or you force people to do things that they might not otherwise do on their own accord. Or you can do things like cooperation. Now, cooperation is attained in a capitalist structure because we're all individuals, enterprises in the hands of individuals, and as individuals, we can choose who we purchase goods of. We're obviously assuming that you've got competition and nobody's got a perfect monopoly. And because we can choose who we purchase different goods from, we have a system where you derive the best benefit that you can from a transaction. So I would only trade with somebody if I was also getting a merit from trading with them. I'm not going to trade if I'm going to be worse off from trading. You also have the system where perhaps I could produce the goods for myself if I didn't want to purchase them off somebody else. So you need almost a capitalist structure where there are alternatives. In a socialist structure, it's the government-owned enterprises that control. So technically you only really have one alternative. You only can go to one person to purchase different goods and services. And so this idea of governmental power, well, Friedman really talked about there, the idea that economic freedom can almost serve as a check to political power. And you could look at this in two ways. Firstly, you can see that political freedom, as Hayek was thinking, if it's taken away from economic power, leads to a more decentralized system. You can have many billionaires in an economy, but you can only really have one true leader that has been elected or been put in power. So it's this idea that you can have freedom of economic arrangements because you have so many different people doing similar things, but you can only have one person leading a party or leading a country. Whereas in a socialist state, that person leading the country also controls the economic arrangements. Now, an interesting example that Friedman cites in his book is when you're looking at trying to protest against the government. So if you want to stage a protest, or you want to try and change the political system in the country, you have to publicise that. You have to propagandise other members of society. So you might provide leaflets or buy television or radio time, organise rallies, and all of these require capital. Now, if you're in a socialist country, if you want capital, you're only ever going to get that if you save up yourself, but you're working for the state. So is the state going to like you actually propagandising against them because you're their employee, or you're going to try and get funds from somebody that's very wealthy, and that's most likely somebody at the top of the hierarchy of the state. Now, they're not likely going to support you because you are actually protesting against a government that's made them rich. So you have to consider both of these points of view. But of course there are ways where you could bypass that, but it's going to be a lot harder, because if you bypass the issue of funding, you have to buy paper from state-owned paper factories or state-owned broadcasting factories. And we actually had this in our country. In 1933, Churchill wanted to tell the people of Great Britain that war was on the horizon. And he went to the British Broadcasting Corporation, BBC, and he said, I want to go on the radio and tell people. And at the time, it was a lot more under the control of the government, and they just said, no, we don't want you doing this. It wasn't at a time where there was censorship enforced, but they just said, no, I don't want you to scaremonger the people of Great Britain, we're going to keep this in control. So it's looking at how, in an economic sense, and if you look at America during the Hollywood blacklist, at a time of America during the Red Scare, they basically said to different actors who were communist in ideology, they put a black mark next to their name and say, you can't work because of your communist ideologies. They tried to ostracize them from the film industry. But the market made this impossible because it made it too costly not to employ these people. Now, if it was a state-owned enterprise, then they could accommodate for that cost. But these are capitalists. They have to work on what will pay the bills, or profit maximization. So it just meant that this Hollywood blacklist was opposed because it made it too costly to support it. And in a capitalist society, I think the role of patron is quite important, and it's quite odd how an inequality of wealth can lead to a preservation of liberty, because you only need one person, one rich person, to support your cause. And there are countless examples through history. I mean, one I learned when I was studying American history was Frederick Vanderbilt Field. He was a very wealthy man, inherited wealth, and he supported lots of communist movements in America. Now, America hated this, but he was still doing it because he didn't owe his wealth to the state. It was private wealth, and he could do what he wants with it. Whereas in a state structure, it's just not possible, or it's very difficult to work into effect. So it's interesting, I think, when you consider it on this dimension. You consider how how capitalism is imperative towards preserving liberty. Because I think Friedman is somebody that believes humans are imperfect. I mean, it's as much as enabling the good to do good as preventing the bad from doing bad. So I don't think he thinks you can have this communist utopia where, if you disagree, it will be heard openly and people will consider that. I think he's somebody that believes in a communist structure. You've got one person that supports it, and he's not going to like people if other people are protesting against it. So really, what is...
So don't you think then that equilibrium in capitalism where everyone's equal, do you think him recognising that everyone's imperfect, don't you think that also means that that equilibrium will quickly disappear? Because
yes.
Some people will exploit other people very quickly.
Yes, I think that's true. I think that's why always in his theories he's got that proviso that there are always alternatives. So if I feel that I'm going to be exploited by entering a transaction with you, I won't go into it. I'll enter a transaction with somebody that won't exploit me. And he also does say there is a very important role for government. There's an important role for government as an umpire, effectively, to maintain the rules of the game if you're looking at it. So they're not going to have a direct presence in the market, or they're not going to have direct presence in people's civil liberties, but they are going to uphold the rules of the game. So it means that if I go into a transaction to you, you're not going to exploit me, or you're not going to say I'm not going to deliver on these goods. You're going to uphold to these contracts and things like that. And that's having a system whereby you have the appropriate legal structures in effect. So he looks quite fervently at this idea of what is the role of government. And of course you've got the traditional ones that look at, preventing negative externalities, providing public goods. And when he talks about public goods, he says that if it's profitable to engage in that particular part of the market, then it should be provided by the private sector, because they then have the incentives to provide it. And naturally the private sector is more efficient than the public sector. So why don't we let them produce it? But if you're looking at something like parks, then it's going to be much harder for a private industry to supply them, because there's no real way of charging people to use parks. So there is an important role of government to play, but he's not saying there's no other role, this isn't anarchy we're talking about here. It's just the role of government is very different to perhaps how we have it today. And I think that's an interesting thought, even if you don't agree with it, to consider this type of view that says that government's just going to act in that way and they're not going to provide health services or education or things like that. And of course you need a system whereby you can minimise negative externalities. But I think he almost thinks that can be accomplished if you have a good, appropriate legal structure, if you maintain property rights. And when discussing negative externalities and trying to minimise them, he says that, well, when a government intervenes in a market, it creates its own negative externalities, because it might fail to compensate or to tax somebody in the appropriate manner that means that externality can be avoided. So I think it's very difficult, and when you're actually reading what he's saying, it's very much, you get the impression that he doesn't even know what's to be done. It's just throughout the book he's flirting with different ideas, and he's looking at perhaps what could be done if you wanted to have he thinks, a better way of governing our society. And of course, the government must make sure it maintains law and order. I mean, that is essential, because as humans are imperfect, he states, if you didn't have governments, we'd all try and exploit each other. We're naturally very greedy. And it's interesting when he comes on to things like, should you have a monopoly in things like rail? Because rail travel is a natural monopoly. It's very hard to have, two sets of rail tracks to one destination, because you can't. It's very difficult to have more than one company in the market, such as we have South Eastern Rail today. You don't really have any other alternatives. So what's the best between private monopoly, and public regulation? And he includes lots of different people that say things like, oh, public monopoly is the best because private monopoly will try and exploit us, or public regulation is the best. He likes to think that private monopoly is the best, and he thinks this is because public regulation of an industry, if you're trying to minimise perhaps exploitation of consumers, will be slow to change. And he analyses in America the system of railway commission that they have there, that he said in effect it prevented competition to the railway companies, because when things like rail travel and also air travel became more widely used, it effectively made the monopoly on rail negligible, because if rail prices soared up, it was assumed that people would just go on cars, or they'd go on buses and things like that instead of trying to use rail, or they'd fly to different destinations. So I mean, it's interesting, and I think he picked an example like railway that's much easier to defend as something where there are more alternatives. But I think when you look at things like water and gas, it becomes a lot harder to try to say, well, a private company will provide an efficient outcome instead of saying the public doing it, or even public regulation. So my view on things like water and gas is that you do need public regulation, otherwise you're sort of providing really an incentive for exploitation and for a private company to do whatever it wants with pricing and things like that. And he also cites this idea that perhaps we should have government intervention on paternalistic grounds, and he said that is an absolute farce, effectively, because as a liberal, he doesn't feel some should decide for the fate of others, especially as it's a temporary majority. Should a temporary majority decide on the welfare of others? He says no, it should be in everyone's own hands, so you should have the liberty to smoke, take drugs, drink, whatever you like, as long as it doesn't infringe upon my liberty or somebody else's liberty. And that's when you look at different levels of regulation and different levels of activity. Right. Now, I wanted to come on to now monetarism, and this is really what he developed. Well, he didn't create it. It was known as quantity theory of money before, and it was it wasn't very popular, but you must remember that at the time he was writing really where Keynes was in every policy making place, on earth. Everyone was adopting his policies because they thought that they really worked. They observed from the Great Recession what had happened, the Great Depression, what had happened about when there wasn't enough levels of aggregate demand, and Keynes was saying we need to fill that gap. So everyone was really subscribing to that view at the time. And he wrote this book in 1962, and it was really in the 60s and 70s that he developed most of his work on this. And it was the idea that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. And he looks at inflation as effectively the root of all evil. And that if you want an economy that's prosperous and endures long-term growth, you need to get rid of inflation, because inflation is detrimental to employment, if you believe the Phillips curve, where you've got that employment and unemployment, inflation and employment trade-off. And he says the main cause of inflation is this excess supply of money, leading to too much money chasing too few goods. And that was something that he said when he was about to receive his Nobel Prize. And this was in a work that was cited by people as something that's very influential, and it built up a lot of traction because they were saying, this does make sense. Inflation is detrimental and we need to combat that. And this is just a simple graph that looks at how you could have an increase in the money supply will cause all of these bad effects. And he was saying we need to combat that. And tight monetary control is required to maintain price stability. And that is very important when you look at credibility. He says that private investors in a liberalised economy need to have credibility in the government. They need to understand that the government is going to stick to its targets and it's not going to inflate away things, because it's going to be detrimental to their investments. If they invest long term and there's going to be inflation, then their profits and their investments are going to be inflated away and they're going to be worthless. So he wants to look at how you can have a tight control of money and you'll lead to price stability. And he also says that governments fine-tuning the economy is also very bad. You cannot use monetary policy, fiscal policy to fine-tune things. You need to allow the markets to fill the void. You need to allow the price mechanism to do what it does best, and that's to keep the market healthy in his view. And he came up with two rules, and these are quite popular when he's talking about his theories. He came up with the Friedman rule, which is the setting of nominal interest rates at 0. And effectively, what he means by this is that a government should try to adopt a policy of deflation. So you know how nominal rate is sort of as it appears. So the government perhaps now is adopting a 0.5% interest rate, base interest rate. So this would be their nominal rate. And he's saying you should pursue a rate of deflation so that the real interest rate on government bonds and perhaps safe assets is 0. And I know this is quite confusing and it takes a little while to sort of get your head around, but what he's trying to say is that the opportunity cost of holding money should be equal to the cost of creating money. Now, a government bank, a central bank, can just create money. You know, like we had the lecture yesterday, it was saying quantitative easing, you can just print more money. It's like that. But you must have that the opportunity cost of holding money, so the interest rate of holding money, should be the same as the opportunity cost of creating money, which should be zero. So, I mean, that's an interesting theory he's presenting, and I'm going to come on to some criticisms later, because this is a theory that doesn't build up much traction at all. And also he comes up with this K% rule, which is quite interesting, that the stock of money should be increased at a fixed rate year in, year out, without any variation in the rate of increase to meet cyclical needs. So what was very popular is this idea that you shouldn't have fine-tuning. So if an economy is going into recession, let the price mechanism recover itself. Let's not have this type of intervention. But also, he was writing at a time with the Great Depression where there was a failure of the central banks to provide liquidity to banks that were having a bank rush. So he's at the same time saying that a central bank needs to provide liquidity to these central banks to prevent a deflationary spiral, but it also should, at the same time, try to meet price stability, and also should increase at a fixed rate year in, year out without any variation. So you should keep pumping money into the economy at a fixed rate, which I don't know what you think about these two rules. I don't think they gain much traction, and I don't think that in our economy they'd be very successful. The European Union, quite surprisingly, bases its monetary policy on money supply targets. So it's a target of money supply going into the economy. And Mervyn King, when he was talking recently about the quantitative easing, was effectively ignoring inflation, because he was saying the money supply in the economy has dropped and we need to increase this. So I think this is almost perhaps a modern example of how it's that central banks are still concerned with the supply in the economy, but unlike quantitative easing, we shouldn't just do it on cyclical needs, we should have it on a fixed rate year in, year out. So I think that's quite interesting, because it's quite simple, this sort of theory that everybody wants the prices that they sell to go up, and also the prices that they buy to go down. So I think it's looking at this sort of rebalance on how people really tackle inflation in an economy, because people perhaps want the prices of goods to go up, they sell to go up, and if they went down, perhaps they would be angry, because they want to make the most profit that they can make, and that they think translates into selling it for more. So it's interesting also that he talks about this sort of, you've got to stop putting money into the economy. And of course he's referring to a lot of fiscal stimuluses that went on during that era, because, as I say, Keynes was very popular in government policy in the time, and this idea of managing the level of aggregate demand. But then it almost, I think, slightly contradicts this idea that the stock of money should be increased year in, year out, because he's saying, in one sense, he's asking for more money to go in, but at a fixed rate, not sort of on their cyclical needs, but asking money to go in, year out, so that you can support the amount of money supply in the economy. But really, when I looked, I think, more into this, a lot of his argument was saying that so much money is taken out of the economy that you really need to maintain a bare minimum in the economy to try and keep that money supply constant. Otherwise, you're just going to effectively have deflation going on in the economy. And it's quite interesting that he's saying you need complete autonomy of monetary control from a government. So we've already spoken about this idea that economic arrangements need to be taken away. But this is the idea even that you should take it away from an independent Federal Reserve or an independent Bank of England. It should be completely taken away, so it's governed in effect by the markets and by this rule that would be put into law, presumably, and you'd have to change it otherwise. But it's an interesting theory when you try and contemplate it, about how you would try and keep this fixed, keep this out of governmental hands, and then would it work? If you took it out of the, if you actually implemented it, would it work in the economy? And I want to come on to later, really, is he right about these theories of monetarism, and is it right to focus solely on inflation above all else? Another thing that he's very famous for talking about is taxation. And this is a quote, I'm not sure if it even makes sense, but to each according to he and the investments he owns produces. So it's effectively, don't tax if you can help it, because everyone should have the liberty to do whatever you want with your money. If you earn a £100,000 salary as opposed to a £20,000 salary, you should have the liberty to do that. And an economy needs to create the incentives for people to earn, try and create, an incentive to earn high levels, and they'll try and do things to actually earn that amount. And an interesting example here in taxation was he was talking about the fact that there are some services that governments do need to provide. This example of the public park, or this upholding rules of the game, paying courts, ensuring law and order is kept in an economy. So he's not denying that you need no taxation, you need low taxation, but he's looking at how you perhaps could have a fairer level of taxation. And this is an example from 1959, so obviously the numbers are a bit different now when you look at tax, if you study sort of the inflation trends over that time. And he says, look at these individual tax returns, income before tax credits. So tax credits would be, for mothers with children and things like that. The state is effectively giving them a tax exempt on something. And this is the tax after tax credit. Now, he analyses here on the bottom, what I've put is that if you had a flat tax rate of 23.5% on everyone's earnings, he said that would earn exactly the same as if you had this level of progressive taxation. So the idea that you're not going to earn the same is not valid in this regard. It's whether it's fair to do this. And I think it's also, since we had yesterday that presentation by Dr. Davies, and you're looking at, well, if people are willing to pay more, should they pay more? But he does write that even though he believes in a flat tax rate, because he believes you should have the liberty to earn whatever you want, you should have the liberty to save money and give it to your children, although that's one aspect, the aspect of inheritance, where it gets quite murky and quite controversial, because people aren't sure whether you should have the liberty to give money to your children or whether you should just have the liberty to earn money yourself. And he's looking at how perhaps a flat tax rate would earn the same amount of money, assuming obviously that tax credits would be rather similar from that amount. And I think it's interesting from that clip that he shows you that he spoke before he died in 2006, and he said that government are going to have to charge more taxes to try to get rid of their government debt. And he said it's not going to be popular, especially in America, but they are going to have to do it. So I don't know whether that would sort of, if he was speaking on it then, whether he might have said we need a flat tax rate of 30% or something like that to try and build it up, or whether it is actually possible to try to pay down a deficit if you reduce public spending at this level. And then there's sort of final theory that is he right as an economist? And this is really quite controversial now, especially since his death, when people start to look at revising his theories once you die. Look at his impact, because he has been voted one of the greatest economists, if not the greatest economist of the 20th century. People normally put Keynes above him. Really, what was his theories? Well, he obviously had a great impact to the field of economics if he was awarded the Nobel Prize. That much is guaranteed. But really, were his theories accurate, and would they have provided success? Well, on the issue of taxation, people generally started to come around to the idea that two wrongs don't make a right. If you look at the wrong, that it's wrong for people with an inequality level of wealth, so wealth that's above average, to keep that wealth themselves and not distribute that through charity, distribute that through other ventures. But it's also wrong for you to take that money. But everyone, pretty much everyone, has assumed that it's politically impossible to ever implement a flat tax rate in an economy. You just would never have the political climate that meant that somebody earning £50 million a year and somebody earning £20,000 a year could earn the same rate of tax. I mean, people think it defies logic on a level because someone might not need that large amount of money. But most of all, his theories on monetarism have come under quite stark contrast of attack, because although it's still a school of economics and there are still followers part of it, the Austrian school sort of branched off from it, people believe that it's just sort of died as a valid theory, because this idea of policy of deflation would effectively, they thought it would cause a recession, and also the fact that complete focus on inflation would be detrimental for an economy, because they saw that in the 1970s, when you had stagflation and you've got high inflation, high unemployment, not the best way to try and tackle inflation at that time would be to perhaps raise interest rates, try and reduce the supply in the economy, because you're really going to attack employment there, you're not going to make it any better, and it's going to be detrimental. And a government has a responsibility to its citizens as elected to try to provide employment for its citizens. So I think people say it's untenable, it's not really going to work. And another interesting theory people are saying is that money itself is very hard to define, and it's very hard to control, because it's sort of this premise that central banks can always control the supply of money, I think is quite a dangerous one, because it's firstly assuming, his K% rule was assuming that money was always going to be leaving the economy, and that people were going to be spending money, they weren't going to be storing it themselves in their bank accounts and things like that. And it's this idea that how do you define money, because obviously assets are changing value all the time. So if I've got a house and it was worth 500,000, and because of perhaps a shortage of supply it's now worth 700,000, I've increased my stock of capital. If I can liquidate that and I get the 200 extra, then I've increased my supply of money effectively. So I don't think people look at it now as a zero-sum game. It's very difficult to define, and it's very difficult to actually control in an economy. And he also, this sort of assumption that by controlling the quantity of money, you could control the level of prices without controlling other impacts in the economy. So without controlling, low growth, causing low growth, or inhibiting employment, as I said, just now. I think that's quite a fallacy, and people have really said to him, no, that can't be right. It's got to be wrong. And I think in many ways it's quite a shame, because there were lots of things about Friedman that he was very right on. He was right to say interest rates are a very effective way of controlling demand, because really it was official doctrine to say fiscal policy has now replaced Adam Smith's theory that interest rates can have a strong effect over demand in the economy. And he said, no, actually interest rates can affect demand, and they're actually a very powerful tool, and we should use them. And that's something that people like Alan Greenspan used a lot. If you look back at 2001, he lowered interest rates and spending did increase, and people say, well, perhaps that caused a boom. But the point is that he sort of reasserted that power for interest rates. He said it's actually very important to have them still as an important government tool. And he also said that it's right about a central bank and a government to have credibility on inflation targets. I went to a lecture by Spencer Dale in, I think, June, and he was arguing then for an increase in the interest rate, because he said the policy, the reason why they have a target, the 2.0 target rate of inflation, is so that the government can maintain its credibility. It needs to make a statement to investors that if you invest, we're going to have relative price stability in an economy. We're not going to inflate away your investment or try and inflate away different things like that, try and raise the price level. And it's important, that credibility, to actually stay. And that's really a lasting contribution that he's made to the subject. It's not his greatest, but it's important. I think he wrote a lot about how we need to have credibility in the economy for public spending and also for inflation. And I think now an example really of people turning away from his theories. I mentioned earlier that the European Central Bank uses money supply. It still does today with its inflation targets, with its interest rate targets, not inflation targets. So it looks at money supply. But when I sort of looked into that, it was believed that that is more applicable to Europe, because they said that it's going to be very difficult. If you set it on basis on inflation, it's going to be very difficult with so many countries, that it's much easier to look at money supply within the combined Eurozone, whereas the Bank of England obviously sets all of its targets on the inflation rate. And it's quite easy for us, because we are a sort of collected nation, we have a collected government, to actually set solely on inflation. As opposed to obviously money supply, and it's much easier to implement interest rates over that instead. And also his theories on sort of liberty, I mean they're educated, I mean people read it a lot, they still read his books on liberty, his views on how social structure. But I think like monetarist theories, I think some people almost think that you can't implement that in a society. Sometimes it's politically untenable, or it's something that's not going to come about very quickly. I think we could all think about perhaps imperfections in this idea that government acts as this umpire, and therefore everyone has a free and easy ride with one another. We can trade with each individuals, we don't have to trade with one particular person. But of course in economics you look at really perfect competition isn't possible. So I think it's this sort of nice idea that he created, and perhaps we can adopt parts of it. But I think most of his theories, I don't want to be sort of cruel towards him because he's obviously an enlightened economist, but I think most of his theories are more sort of ideological, and perhaps we can work more towards that, but I don't think we could ever implement them fully. So I hope that sort of in this brief lecture I provided more of an understanding of Friedman and perhaps some of Friedman's biggest works and biggest highlights about what he's most famous for. And I wonder if you've got any questions.
And going back to the flat tax rate, why do you think you would? What was the point of it? Because you mentioned that it'd raise the same income as having progressive tax system, but then why have a flat tax system?
I think it's this idea that it removes that incentive to evade and avoid taxation. I think he was looking at a country like America where lots of their very wealthy people tried to avoid taxation by having non-dom status in different countries, and they try and evade taxation through charitable funds and lots of different ways, and there are lots of different loopholes in the tax system. And I think he was saying, if you drop it down to that level, we can remove all of our loopholes, so we can remove things, maybe remove different tax credits or different things like that, try and remove what we have at the moment, and you'll raise more taxation as a base of that. And I think that was really what George Osborne was thinking when he thought, I'll lower my tax rate down to 40. It will create more of an incentive in this country to actually abide by our taxation rate, as opposed to trying to avoid or evade it. I think it's interesting that 23.5%, because the government at the time had it ranging from 90 to about 20%. So even the lowest income earners wouldn't actually sort of have a significant rise in their level of taxation. And I think it's easy sort of how the maths worked out there, that sort of correlation. I just don't think it's politically sort of acceptable.
And ethical.
Ethical, yes. That sort of 50 million, 20,000, should they pay the same rate of tax? And most people, I think, would say no.
What do you think about the monetarist theory of unemployment? Because that was quite controversial. This was quite personal to this lecture, because Friedman helped to conceive the idea, as it were.
Yes, I think I think like some of his other theories, it's come under a lot of criticism because of this. I think this idea that people are sometimes quite scared to withdraw fiscal support for different public services, and they're scared of the withdrawal in employment that would have. And I think sometimes it's this idea that if you stop having subsidised industries, because obviously his theory of unemployment was quite similar to Adam Smith's. I think it was quite an extension on, if that's what you're referring to.
I know. I was referring to the one on unemployment whereby nobody is ever involuntarily unemployed. They're simply not offering their labour at a low enough price for them to be employed.
Yes. I think that is an extension on from Adam Smith, because I think he was saying that the market would always provide an opportunity to actually find employment if you remove the restrictions on the market, like minimum wages. Yeah. And I think it was difficult, because even he was writing at a time in the Great Depression where the market had completely failed, because there were people, I think, who were willing to work for bread and food. during some of the Great Depression. But there weren't the type of jobs, and it's that deflationary spiral. And I think he sort of says, well, he ignores that because he said, well, right from the start, the Federal Reserve was failing to provide liquidity for banks, so that should never have happened. But I think it's quite controversial, and I think it's coming on to taxation again. Is it ethical to remove these sort of minimum wages? Is it ethical to sort of let people work for whatever they really want to work at?
But then wouldn't you say that he's writing and commentating from a position of relative sort of stability and security, because he knew that the government was filled with Keynesianists and that nothing was ever going to be done in the next 20 years that there would have been anything like his money.
I think it's a very interesting observation, and it's interesting when you apply that, because he really was a supporter of. He worked with Reagan's government, and that was a great where he underwent lots of liberalisation, and he supported Margaret Thatcher's government as well. This sort of theory: remove trade unionist powers, let's try and lower the wage rate, because if you've got unemployment and they're just not willing to work for the right prices. I think almost in our sort of era of globalisation, and you see sweatshops, I think people have sort of the sort of images of it now, people working for whatever will provide of them. I think that's sort of really become an objective that you just couldn't have in this modern age, and that you do still need things like minimum wages that people can survive on. But it's interesting. I didn't touch on it in this lecture, but it's interesting his theories on what you should support. And he says that you should never actually give money to people in the form of unemployment benefits. And if their wage is below a level by which they can't support themselves, then you give them credits to use for food, or credits on housing and things like that. But I know that the Austrian School of Economics, they're really looking into trying to sort of carry on his theories and how you'd have that in a modern age of that level, of how you could have no minimum wages and yet still have a fair system. So it's an interesting point. Any other questions?